Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Lee Battle and I'm the new host for this series. I've just taken over from the wonderful Jenny Mills. And I am a minister here in Cardiff in a place called Pulpit Community Church, which is a five-way ecumenical setting. And it's really wonderful to be here. Each week, I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And so today, I am so pleased to introduce Revd Dr Craig Milward. Craig is a Baptist minister, an educator, a political lobbyist and author. He lives in South Yorkshire and is about to embark on a new venture with friends Roy Searle and Kate Pozzo. Northumbria Collective aims to help Christians to listen well, to think deeply and live authentically in a world that is often interested in Jesus when he isn't mentioned in the same conversation as church, which just sounds so fascinating. So Craig, thank you so much for being with us today. So politics in the pulpit, I wonder what that means for you. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and whether or not you see yourself as a pulpit politician?
Okay, yeah, I mean, politics is about people, isn't it? And, you know, whatever we think we're actually doing when we stand in front of people, talking to them, preaching to them, whatever else, what we're hoping to do is to achieve some kind of human engagement. So politics, you can't help but do politics. Unfortunately, you know, we use the word and we think of party politics and we think of all that's going on and at the moment, but all that's going on around the world as well. And I guess we just throw up our hands and we think, well, how can we get engaged with that? But at its basic level, it's about people. So I don't think you can help but be political in a sense. Yeah. Whereas pulpit just makes me sad. It really does. To me, it's a symbol that's so unhelpful in lots of different ways. I mean, you're normally standing above people. You're normally speaking down to them. Because I'm trained and they're not, maybe, at least certainly in the same way I am. That means that I know and they don't. It means that I'm active and they're passive. It means that I'm teaching and are they learning? I don't know, because if facts help people grow, we'd be the wisest people on the planet. But
absolutely,
does it happen? But primarily, I mean, the biggest thing for me is that we've modeled our understanding of what it means to be a Christian and to be a Christian, to be professional Christians on an Old Testament system where, you know, back then there was temple and synagogue. The temple was a kind of it was a one-off place. It was a place that people went to maybe a few times in their lives if they didn't live around the corner from it. Whereas synagogue was somewhere they went to every week, and synagogue was a family home. Not led by a politician. And it was about where you did life. It was about where you apprenticed. It was about where real life happened, and you gathered around a meal table, and just like Jesus did with his disciples, you know, at the Last Supper. Whereas we've turned it into an event, and we've turned so much into a temple event, where professionals do their thing and where everybody else just gawps. And I just think, change happens in a synagogue setting. Life happens in a synagogue setting, and I've been a church minister for a long time. I'm not currently serving a church, and I don't particularly want to go back to doing it, simply because the model that we've inherited just simply isn't helpful. I know it's been deconstructed in lots of places, and we're in process of doing that. And certainly, I was where I was. But so for me, that pulpit idea is still quite a negative thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think. Pulpits are something very historical, and that kind of 10 feet above contradiction idea that you get with it, it's above and not with people. I understand that. So from your context then, Craig, what would you want us to hear as key justice issues or political events? So each week I ask my JPIT colleagues for a little roundup of their expertise about the issues going on in the world around us at the moment. And so they have mentioned this week, obviously, we're about to hear about a new Prime Minister in the UK at, I think, 12:30 today. And so we will have both a new Conservative Party leader and a Prime Minister coming in. So that's definitely something that is, I think, in all of our minds. And I think more so because of the energy crisis, the fact that this Prime Minister is going to step into a real storm and have to be active very quickly to avert this huge crisis that feels like it's looming in this country. We also have the ongoing war in Ukraine in the background, the devastating floods in Pakistan, which have affected so far around 33 million people, with over 1,000 dead, with that number expecting to rise. We've had overnight the violence in Canada, the sporadic stabbings, and so much of the world seems to feel like it's in flux. So what would you pull out as the key issues from your place and space that you would like our listeners or readers to hear about today?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I wake up to the Today program every morning, and I quite often I get to the point where I think I wish I hadn't done that, because the news tends to be quite bad. But then I also have to remind myself, and this is the first thing that I have to keep drawing myself back to, that just because the news outlets think that that's the news, actually, the biggest piece of news is that most people, most of the time, are reaching out in small ways and want to have a positive influence in the world. Yeah. And I just have to remind myself of that. So I'm not intending to contradict you in any way, but I just think in order to remain sane sometimes, in an utterly crazy world, but also in the world where the media is telling us that news is always bad.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, yes, we do need to sit up and look. And I think I know we haven't come to the passages yet, but I think that's why the Jeremiah passage is just so incredibly powerful. I mean, perhaps I will skip ahead to the Jeremiah passage as a way of, answering or reflecting on that question.
I think it's also important to mention that we are especially coming into the Jeremiah text, we are in the season of creation now, where as churches, as Christians, we think about God's creation, how we take care of it, are we not taking care of it, which is, again, such a newsworthy thing at the moment. And also this week is Education Sunday. So with our metaphorical newspapers open in one hand, let's open our Bibles. So as you've said, Craig, you would like to start, or it feels more natural to start with the passage from Jeremiah this week. So do you want to take us through your thoughts for that?
Yeah, and then I could go back to reflecting on that question, the earlier question you just asked me. But
yeah,
I read that Jeremiah passage, and it could have been written about today, couldn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
it really.
A remarkable passage. It's about echoes of climate change in there. There's war. There's all sorts of. Now, those who don't perhaps believe, for whatever reason, that there is a larger pattern to it, or that there is even perhaps the existence of a loving God somewhere in the mix, I don't know how they could almost live with that. I had a massive storm, I don't know about you, overnight, and I actually got up and I looked out of the window and the crashes and the bangs, and the first thing that went to my mind, I just thought to myself, I know exactly why those in primitive times believed the gods were angry with each other.
Yeah.
But I think something similar is happening. If you haven't got any kind of anchor something similar must be happening in so many places. You know, I'm a volunteer at a National Trust house, and we had an elderly couple of who were Ukrainians who had spent 2 months. They were disabled elderly couple who'd spent 2 months in their cellars in Bucha, who are now with their daughter here in the South Yorkshire. And as they're walking through the room, and I discovered their story. Again, I was trying to take myself back to that and imagine what it was like to live in that kind of circumstance for 2 months in a cellar with no light and no power and no food, no heat. I just couldn't imagine it. Whereas, you know, we have an opportunity to ask a different question, because we believe that there is actually a God who is able to speak to us and has a message to speak. And so the Jeremiah passage, you know, it's got the echoes of climate change and war, but we maybe ask a different question.
Yeah,
we should ask a different question, but first of all, it's incredibly difficult to ask that difficult question, because we're just as invested in the world as our neighbors and our friends.
Yeah.
But you know, that passage in Jeremiah is just quite remarkable. And what I do I've got this framework of many frameworks for understanding the Old Testament, but one of the frameworks through which I understand the Old Testament is that if you go through it chronologically, you know, however you understand the Old Testament and how it was written and everything else, you go through it chronologically, it begins with a patriarch.
Yeah.
It begins with someone who walks with God, and a series of patriarchs actually. But think of Abraham is probably the preeminent one, and all the tests that, you know, that his God took him through, and he got to know his God through those tests. And of course, patriarchs give way to judges, and judges, they've got the written text, but they don't know God in the same way. Then you've got kings who are more interested in, well, of course, you've got that famous passage at that verse at the end of Judges, you know, where God allows them to have kings, but warns them of the consequences. The kings rule nations rather than on behalf of God, rather than refer to God. And then once the kings, you've got more and more bad kings, and the good kings depart into the past. Then God has to resort to prophets, and of course, prophets are distanced. And so what you've got there is this growing sense of distance. Patriarch, judge, king, prophet. And then, of course, Jesus takes that over with his denunciation of nationalistic religion, but we can come on to that. And there's that verse in there which is, my people are fools. Because the Jeremiah passage it's addressed to God's people in the midst of chaos. And that's how I think how we should understand that, or how we should reach out to that passage, take comfort from that passage. That God hasn't stopped speaking to us, even though what he says isn't necessarily going to be comfortable. Because
exactly, this conversation.
The whole thing about Old Testament prophets, it's I will woo you, I'll warn you, I'll call you, and then I'll declare the consequences if you don't listen. I just kind of feel that maybe we're in a season of, not that we've made all the choices, but a season of consequence. But that passage still speaks to us.
Very much so.
So the two questions that come out of that for me are, how do I understand the state of Christian Orthodoxy in Russia? You know, I don't understand. I understand historically. I understand Orthodoxy. I've done a PhD in church history and theology, so I kind of understand it, but I don't understand it. I don't get it. I ask myself, where are the prophets speaking into that?
Very much so. And the context of the Jeremiah passage is literally just before they are captured. Jerusalem's captured by Nebuchadnezzar. So it really does feel like you said, that it's this kind of last ditch now. You've had this, you've had that, you've had this. I'm talking to you now, and this is right now before the consequence of this, of you not listening, of this, and this is what's going to happen. And the conversation between Jeremiah and God is just, as soon as I read it for this week, it's just haunting, isn't it? About just where we are now, and how this could be spoken right into our situations. But like you say, on many levels, both on the climate level, on how we listen, how we share, what's going on across the world. And this sense of, I heard a phrase by Carl Holiday, like decreation is like the undoing of God's creation. And that really stuck with me this week. Is this not where we're at now? Have we not undone God's creation? And have we tipped it now so far to a point that we can't do anything about this now? Or is this now this call for unity and collective action in a way that I think we've been overprivileged enough not to have to deal with before? We've been so, especially in Western Christianity, so individualistic with our Christianity, that we've kind of like we've gone off and believed our own ways of doing things, and we've gone away from hearing each other, and actually being forced to act in a way that is more unified and more collective, and that I find both haunting and hopeful.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because we must always hold on to hope.
Yes,
things may not end up being the same, and I think a lot of things are going to be changing. Lots of things are in flux currently, but that the Russia is the kind of one side of it, if you like, that I reflect on from Genesis, from Jeremiah. But then there's also this. See how the nations are we're still ignoring the scientific prophets of our age.
Yeah.
And they I mean, because the scientific prophets are reading the book of creation.
Yeah.
You don't, this kind of idea that somehow science and religion is. I know scientists and religious people are often at odds, but science and religion aren't necessarily at odds.
No.
Scientists are reading the book of the book of science and are telling us things that they see.
Yeah.
And again, there's that. Where are the prophets in that age? Well, but it feels like there are enough of them out there, but we aren't listening.
Yeah.
And we don't listen because we think we know better, or because,
of course,
because at least it's working. Those who don't listen tend to be the powerful people who could change things, and the powerful people currently who could change things feel that they're still doing quite well with things as they are.
Yeah.
And so there's no motivation to change, and that is why change doesn't happen. And I then ask myself, where are Christians in this mix?
Yeah.
This is where those other two passages begin to come to the fore. But perhaps before I'm very aware that I brought Jeremiah in quite early in the conversation, so I don't feel like I have to bring those other two passages in right now. We can perhaps dig a bit more deeply into the political themes if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I'm very happy to move on and reflect back as you want to do, Craig.
Well, I'm just thinking, perhaps more broadly, where politics is right now. And I'm aware that I'm kind of sharing my views, and I'm not trying to proselytize or convince anybody they have to be the same as me. But I've my question in your list of questions is kind of what unique take do I have on justice related sort of situations? And I do have experience, as you read at the beginning, working with politicians both in the EU Parliament, or mostly in the European Parliament, but also occasionally in the UK Parliament. And so I kind of am a little bit aware of the way politics works. But also, personally, I'm sure we'll all have different positions on what this last couple of years have been like. But, I found myself just getting increasingly angry at the state of UK politics.
Yeah.
And whenever I remind myself of my interaction with individual politicians, I remember that so many of them are good, decent, honest people. And unfortunately, it's the ones that make the headlines that very often are the ones that aren't.
Yeah.
But actually, I've met dozens and dozens of very good politicians who are really trying to do the right thing. Now, we might disagree on the basics on what the right thing is, but nevertheless, the majority. So again, I have to remind myself of that when I get angry, when I find myself getting angry, that actually most politicians are good, decent, honest people. But I'm hoping that once we get through some of the chaos, and if we do get through some of the chaos, who knows, that, you know, I feel like we've missed a crucial opportunity which was presented to us by the pandemic.
Yeah.
I personally, if I'd been Prime Minister at that time, I think I would have called together the big beasts, irrespective of their political labels, called them together. People who have been used in the past, I don't know, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, people like that, irrespective of the labels, people who know how to pull levers and get things done, draw them together, put them in charge of sorting out the pandemic so the government can get on with leading the country. But of course that didn't happen, and of course I can understand all the reasons why it didn't, but that was an ideal opportunity to mobilize local councils, voluntary organizations, school faith groups, and whatever, and so that we all come together. But just because we missed that moment, I think that is still part of the solution. And so I sort of hope and pray that we don't find ourselves as a nation, but I mean wider than a nation, as a single nation, that we don't find ourselves letting politicians do the politics. But
it very much does feel like, with the pandemic, it kind of underneath that was this sense of a kind of new hope, a new way of doing and of being, and like you say, that just seems to have dissolved, and actually somehow we feel more I think politically kind of done to, rather than actually being a part of it. And I think today, as we sit here, we'll find out later who the new Prime Minister is going to be. And again, do we dare to hope in this that with everything that's going on, with all the challenges that are coming our way, that this might be something that unites us rather than it's something that splits us again down into even more kind of small fragments and pockets of people who weren't struggling but now are struggling, and bigger and better labels that keep people in places rather than bringing us together as a nation and going, this is tough. I agree. How do we actually get through this, and how do we learn our lessons? How do we create new ones for the future?
I think there are two. I mean, it'll become clear already. I'm politically, I'm not a big C conservative by any means. But I listening to the news today, listened to the news this morning, and also reading it over the last couple of days. I do. For me, there are two signs of hope, and I one of them being that Boris's cabinet were made up of friends and those who wouldn't stab him in the back. And in my opinion, they were all lightweights. It appears that Liz Truss is not going to do that, and I'm hoping the other thing of course that what that enables is a more presidential style leadership, where everything all became about Boris and how he made the right decisions. And I mean, cabinet government isn't supposed to be like that.
No,
it doesn't need to be like that, but it is like that if you just surround yourself with weak people. And so I'm hoping that's going to change. But also, it seems to me that everybody's saying that Liz Truss is more of a conviction politician. Now, I will probably disagree with most of the things that she's convicted by, but nevertheless, we may end up, or hope we end up, with a discussion based more on values and principles than on personality and boosterism and all of that. And because I think that's what our nation needs more than anything else, is a series of big discussions. And because of the way in which we seesaw between left and right in our, we more recently we haven't, but historically, we have, I mean, historically, we get politicians who tell us things that we instinctively don't believe, and then they get attacked by the media, and then find themselves in a defensive position, and it becomes impossible for us to have a national conversation because it's all attack defense all the time, both ways. And of course that happens as trust breaks down, happens in any relationship, doesn't it? If you lose trust in somebody, you tend to, it's harder and harder to actually listen to them and believe them.
Yeah.
But we have a media that's attacking the government, a government that's defending itself and hiding itself and isn't honest about. Whereas other countries, and it tends to be those that do have coalitions, are forced to have coalitions, there have been various times when they've had big national conversations about things.
Yeah.
So Germany, for example, I mean, it was a number of years ago now, they for example, they agreed that their health service was falling apart. So rather than a particular political group say, well, these are the answers, we're going to do this, and then have them reverse when a new party comes in, they initiated a national conversation. So we all know it's broken. Yeah. Let's commit ourselves to a process which political parties, as long as you don't get the crazy ones coming in, that political parties will commit themselves to continuing for the next generation.
Yeah.
They do that because they're forced into coalition. They're forced to talk to each other. They're forced to listen to each other. They're forced to agree, yes, some of the things you said are right. You know, I long for Liz Truss to stand up today or tomorrow and say, you know what, the Labour Party had it right on climate, you know, on climate change.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, on cost of living. And we're going to do what they suggested. But of course, it'll never happen. It won't happen. It'll be presented as something slightly different, and it'll be a conservative idea. But why do we always have to live like that? But you see, the reason that I go on at length is because they are all kingdom values.
Yes,
they're what we believe as Christians. They're the way we believe the kingdom will come. They're all kingdom values.
Yeah,
and I find myself saying, where is the church in this?
Where
is the church?
Yeah, we're not shouting
because
what are the kingdom values, you know?
Yes, and again, the pandemic was an incredible opportunity for those in church leadership. I honestly believe, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I honestly believe that if some of the national characters had gone, for example, one had gone to the BBC and say, let me help, let us have a conversation about what it really means to take care of your neighbor, reach out to your neighbor, heal communities in the middle of pandemic.
Yeah.
That could have been, there could have been a series of discussions on that. Yeah. But no, the church is more interested in, more fearful about what the finances are going to be after the pandemic, and looking at ourselves and arguing. But these are all kingdom values that we can be offering.
Yeah.
But
could you see any of these kingdom values in any of the other readings today?
Well, what I see in the other readings is pretty much kind of what I've been reflecting on, because you've got we've touched the Jeremiah passage. Yeah. Of course, the Luke 15 passage is an amazing one.
Yes, it is.
But of course, unfortunately, it is a text that tends to preach itself in many churches, and I'm not sure we've always got it right.
Yeah.
Often it's preached as you're lost, we're the found ones, come and join us and God's going to be happy sort of idea, so you've got as if there's only one repentance that's important. There's one that gets you over the line, and then everything Jesus did for you was counted for you and God's happy. Whereas, those of us who know our theology know that simply isn't true. Salvation isn't an event, it's a process. Repentance is a saying yes to God followed by a yes and a yes and a yes and a yes. Yeah. It's something that becomes a habit. It's not just turning around once, it's turning and then walking in that direction. And so, but our traditions have made it very easy to be converted, and it makes it very difficult to disciple. And so the Luke 15 passage, of course, the chapter divisions in our Bibles are quite new additions. So Luke intends us to understand that Jesus has just called on the Pharisees, or just upset the Pharisees, the religious people. He's just given a great banquet for the poor instead of the privileged. And he's just taught about the cost of discipleship. And it goes straight into the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the prodigal, and the parable of the prodigal. So Luke 15 is clear to me. It's not about those outside our churches who are lost. It's a call to those who think they are in, and simply saying, no, you're out, actually, unless you're actually living the life that you're being called to live, one step at a time. And so it echoes Jeremiah, where Jeremiah, it's all about my people. the Luke passage is, my people don't know me, they don't know who I am.
Mm.
And of course, those two parables, the two parables of the lectionary reading for this weekend, are followed by this for the great prodigal son, which is exactly the same. Churches tend to focus on the lost son, whereas actually the primary focus, because of the Luke 14 that it follows, Jesus' primary focus isn't on the lost son at all. It's on the one who stayed at home, the one who doesn't know his father. And so again, it's a call to live kingdom lifestyle. It's a call to represent this God that we say we know, and then of course that's underlined by the 1 Timothy passage. These are all of a theme for me.
The insurance policy.
Well, but the 1 Timothy passage is amazing because it's Paul, who is the Pharisee of the Pharisees, the one who had all the badges, who ticked all the boxes, saying that actually, you know what, even though I was once a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. And you go, this is the one that knew the law. This is the one who was a Pharisee, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's all, that is just so intrinsically linked to the Luke passage as it should be understood. And again,
and I think
it's a call to God's people to recognize the benefits of this relationship that we've been called into. And
I think kind of certainly with the lost sheep and stuff, you know, we've attached labels to the lost sheep and added that in. But then if you think about it in kind of in kingdom terms, you know, 1 out of 100, 1%, how willing we've become to let as churches, as Christians, let that 1% go rather than fight for them. You know, certainly I think of myself as somebody who's disabled, part of the LGBTQI community, and how churches have so readily gone, that 1% is a bit difficult, we'll keep the 99 and we'll not fight for you, we're not going to bring you back over our shoulders, we're not going to shout for joy. If this was a mathematical equation, so what, with, you know, that 1% is skimmed, is gone. And actually we don't put that effort in to make that to help that 1% come in. And we're going to be challenged, I think, more and more over the next few months as churches as to actually how we do the kingdom of God in real life now, as people are going to be struggling in more obvious ways than they have before. I think the pandemic cracked this open, and now we're going to see part of this, and we have to be the kingdom. But it's amazing when we think about it sometimes how far away we've got from that, and how ready we are to kind of cut and shut people out, that they're too difficult a group of people.
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. Let me just give you another angle on that.
Yeah, sure.
Because something that's jumped out at me. You know, if I was to be, I don't preach very much these days. Very rarely do I these days, because I'm much more involved in politics than I am, if you like, in churches. But if I was preaching on the Sunday, I would actually be tempted to preach the Jeremiah text, because there is, we talked about this resonant imagery, of course, it's all in there. And we know it's written for a specific era and addresses the failings of God's people right then, and all of that. You can't bring all. But the reason why is because I actually know a little over a long period about Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, all that region. I've been into that region a number of times. I've taught there, I've done stuff there, I've met lots of people there. And so what jumped out at me was actually an understanding of the people who would now be tempted to write off in a similar way to the way that it was you that triggered this thought in my mind. Because over there, life is simpler, it's more traditional, and actually people are less well educated very often. I can remember an old guy that I stayed with in one of those great big, those great big identical 15-story blocks that they have all over the big cities, over in the Russian cities. and he brought out his atlas to try to get me. I didn't speak much Russian. He didn't speak any English, obviously. He tried to get me to point to him where I came from, and it was an atlas of Russia with grey around the edges.
Okay.
So that was the only atlas it was a Soviet era atlas, but that was the only thing he had. So I had to try and help him to understand that I lived in the grey and there's more beyond.
Yeah.
And he was really struggling because of course, so life is much much simpler. And of course, the Second World War has long historic and cultural roots in the way in which that land was devastated many times by right and left. And the reason I preach it, the lens through which I preach it, is because we think in terms of opposing labels, black, white, us and them, and that's why we don't go after the one. And we don't go after the one because we're afraid often to change our minds. We have what we have.
Yeah.
But think in terms again of kingdom labels, and let's just let's just use Acts 2 as the way of trying to understand the things that we don't understand. So Acts 2, you've got that bit in Acts 2 where the Spirit comes, and it's quite clear that we're meant to understand that the coming of God brings a sharing. I think what happens there is that the immediate presence of God, or however we understand that passage, I think we become less fearful of running out ourselves. So therefore you find the church sharing, those who had lots shared with those who didn't have any. Rejoicing. There was the leveling of everything. There was joy. There was all of that. And that to me is one of the passages which defines authentic Christian living in community, where none of them considered anything to be his own but shared with each other. Now, I remember a time when I was doing some teaching in Russia, and I'd been invited to go and do it by a group of Americans. Yeah. So there's a group of Americans, there were some Russians, there was my Russian translators, and we were sitting around a table. And I brought up the passage, the Acts passage, and I said to them, you know what? The Acts passage to me looks a little bit like what the communist ideal was. Okay. And of course, the Russians got it instantly. Now, of course, they weren't naive. They were Christians. They were, and we're not talking about Orthodox Christians. They were evangelical Christians. Yeah. Evangelical over there meant something very different to the way it means over here. So they were people who were serious about Scripture. Yeah. And also not naive about their own history. But yes, they saw the link and they said, yes, there were good things about communism. There were good things. We were forced to, we didn't force to share, we did share. And of course, all my experience of Russia is that people are still so incredibly generous, certainly Christians, with the little that they've got. And then the Americans around the table, I could see them getting incredibly offended because, of course, they come with their anti-communist stuff, to them, and they simply didn't get it. And they became angry, they became defensive, and they couldn't see the link between Acts 2 and at least what communists were attempting to become, albeit very badly and corruptly. And that to me became a symbol of how closed we can be, but also how much converting we need to the values of the kingdom of God. How blind we can be. Whilst we don't realize sometimes how blind, I don't realize how blind I am until I see somebody who sees through different eyes. And that for me was a profound experience. Yeah. So as I think about, the war and everything else, and we're tempted to think of Russians as, well, I suppose the enemy and stuff, I can't help remembering that occasion. Yeah. I can't help remembering about the ways in which over the years, on a number of occasions, Russians have taught me the values of the kingdom in the way that living in a Western society that I was brought up in, I needed that window into it. So I just kind of wanted to tell that story. Again, it's a kingdom values thing. It's absolutely. How shaped am I by kingdom values? Yeah. Because I don't think I am. I am within a certain context, but and I think, again, being a follower of Christ is someone who's willing to see things differently, who's actually opening ourselves up and wanting to be changed, wanting to see different perspectives.
Yeah.
And so that all of that is behind the reading of that Jeremiah text and the you know, and the,
Yeah.
and all that I'm seeing in the news and everything else. And I found myself, my heart kind of breaks.
Yeah.
Because I know things aren't as simple as the us and them narrative that we so often fall into.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Craig, honestly, I could listen to you all day. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom and such rich, real life reflections with us today. Thanks to the rest of you for joining us to ask whether or how we should preach politics in our pulpit this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We love to have an ongoing conversation with our listeners about faith and politics, so do join in. We are on Twitter with the handle pulpit_politics, or use hashtag politics in the pulpit, or on our Facebook community, which you can access through the JPIT website, through the JPIT Facebook page, and on their website, jointpublicissues.org.uk. And so this week, as we head into a lot of other change, I guess the question for me is, what, where, and how do we implement our kingdom values? Do let us know your thoughts on Twitter or on Facebook. And so, as we finish, may we finish with a blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.